She arrived at the military base dressed in plain clothes with a calm look on her face, and no one knew who she was or why she was there. Her steps were steady, her eyes scanning each guard post, each tower, each vehicle, as if she had been here before. Or maybe just memorized every detail from somewhere else. Her shoes were dusty from the road, her clothes simple and clean, but old, not the kind of old from being forgotten in a closet, but the kind of old that carries stories, the kind that holds memories in its threads. And the sun hit her at an angle that made her silhouette stretch long across the gravel road. The first guard spotted her from a distance and raised a hand to halt her, but she didn't flinch, she didn't slow her stride. She just looked at him with eyes that didn't match her quiet appearance, eyes that carried weight, like she had seen too much or lost too much, or maybe both. The guard called out again, louder this time, and stepped in her path. His voice was firm but uncertain, because something about her didn't fit. Something about her made him hesitate. She stopped only a few steps away from him, her head tilted slightly as if listening to something he couldn't hear, and then she spoke with a voice that was low and even and strange in the way it seemed to carry without effort. She said she was here to see someone important. She didn't give a name, she didn't ask permission, she just stated it like it was fact, like there was no chance they would refuse her request. The guard blinked, caught off guard by the calm in her tone and the stillness in her body, like she was in no rush because she already knew how this would go. Asked her for identification, and she reached into her pocket slowly, pulling out a small folded piece of paper worn at the edges, but when he unfolded it, there was nothing written, nothing at all, just a blank page, as if it had been wiped clean by time or water or something else. He looked up confused, and she said quietly that the ink was never meant to last, that only the right eyes would know what to see. The words made no sense, but they gave him chills because there was something in the way she said them, something final, something heavy. Other guards began together, drawn by the strange interaction and the stillness in the air that felt wrong or too quiet for a place like this. They questioned her again, but she never raised her voice, never stepped back, never acted like she was lost or afraid. She kept saying she was here to see someone important, someone who would recognize her, someone who owed her more than they could ever repay. And it wasn't a threat or a demand, it was something else, something colder than I thought. After a few tense minutes, the commanding sergeant was called over, and he was already irritated before he even reached the scene. But the moment he saw her, his expression changed, not with recognition, but with a strange unease, like when you see a dream come to life, one you don't remember until it's standing in front of you in daylight. He asked her again for ID, and again she offered the blank paper, and again she said the same thing, and he frowned deeper because this was not protocol, this was not anything they trained for. Told her she would need to leave the base immediately, and she nodded as if she expected that answer, as if it was just another step in a process already set in motion. She turned slowly, like she was going to walk away, but not with the energy of someone defeated, more like someone who was just waiting for the next part to begin. Her feet crunched on the gravel, her shoulders still squared, her pace steady, and the guards didn't follow her. They just watched her go, confused and strangely reluctant, like turning their backs on her felt wrong somehow. But as she passed the checkpoint gate, her sleeve shifted in the breeze and something dark peeked out from beneath the fabric on her arm, and one of the guards caught sight of it, just a glimpse, but enough to freeze him in place. He squinted, leaned forward, and then shouted for her to stop, his voice louder than before, sharp enough to make the others snap to attention. And she stopped again, this time not turning around, but waiting still, as Stoneth officer, who had been watching from a distance, now walked closer, his boots thudding heavy on the dirt, his rank clear on his shoulder, but his expression unreadable. He stepped to where she stood and gestured for her to lift her sleeve, and without hesitation she did, and there it was, the mark that had faded and inked by hand, not by any machine, but done in a way that spoke of ritual, of meaning, of something deeper than art or identity. The officer leaned in, his eyes narrowing and then widening as recognition dawned, not of her face, but of the symbol itself, one he had not seen in many years and hoped never to see again. It was not on any official record, it was not in any training manual, it was not supposed to exist, but there it was inked into her skin like a secret that refused to be whispered softly so that no one else could hear. Is that real? And she turned her head slightly and nodded once, and that small motion sent a ripple through the air around them like something ancient had just been acknowledged, like a memory that had waited patiently was now ready to rise again. No one spoke for several long moments, and the guards who had once doubted her now looked at her with unease. Or both, because they didn't know what that tattoo meant, but they could tell that the officer did, and his face was pale and his lips were pressed tight like he was holding something back, something he couldn't share. Not here, not yet. He turned to the others, waved them off, told them to stand down, and his voice was different now, softer but heavier and filled with something unspoken like regret or gratitude or fear. He asked her to follow him, and she did without a word, and as they walked together toward the heart of the base, the rest of them stood silent, unsure of what they had just witnessed, but knowing somehow that nothing would be the same again. Walked beside the officer in silence, the gravel crunching beneath their steps as the wind moved gently through the wires and fences around the base. Her presence seemed to shift the air around them, as if the place itself remembered her, even if the people did not. He kept looking at her out of the corner of his eye, his mind racing with questions he dared not ask, not yet, not until they were somewhere safe, somewhere quiet, where walls would not have ears and eyes would not be watching from every window. The hallway they entered was cold and sterile, filled with the soft hum of old fluorescent lights and the occasional static from distant radios. She moved through it without hesitation, as if she knew every turn, every room, every door, and he noticed that her footsteps made no echo. Her presence was light, almost weightless, like she had learned long ago how to walk without being heard. They passed several officers and soldiers, all of whom paused to glance at her, then quickly looked away, sensing something they did not understand but respected nonetheless. They entered a secure room at the end of the corridor, one used for classified briefings or high-level interrogations. It had no windows, only a single table and 2 chairs and a large screen on the wall that hadn't been used in years. He shut the door behind them, locked it with a code she could not see, or so he thought, and then turned to face her, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression torn between suspicion, curiosity, and something else, something older and deeper, like recognition buried beneath years of silence. He asked her who she was really, not the name on any database, not the role she claimed at the gate, but the truth, the kind of truth that never gets written down, and she said her name softly, but it wasn't just a name, it was a call sign, one used only once in the past and then erased from every record the moment the operation ended. His breath caught in his throat because he knew that name. He had heard it once whispered in the dark by a man who didn't live long enough to explain what it meant. Asked where she had been all these years, and she told him she never left, not really, not the way people think. She had been in the shadows, working under layers so deep even the commanders above him didn't know she existed. Her missions were never acknowledged, her orders came through ghost channels, her results attributed to luck or accidents or sometimes no explanation at all. She said there are some units so secret they don't have names, and some soldiers so invisible they become legends and then vanish. Asked why she came back, why now, and she said it was because something was coming, something they weren't ready for, something even she couldn't stop alone. She rolled up her sleeve again and showed him the tattoo, the faded ink still sharp in its intent. It wasn't just a symbol, it was a warning, a key to a message that had been encoded in places no one had looked, because no one knew where to look except those who carried the mark and those who survived what came before. She asked him if he remembered Operation Black Winter, and he nodded slowly, not because he had been part of it, but because he had read a single redacted sentence in a document buried beneath 10 layers of clearance, a sentence that said all surviving assets are to be classified beyond level 9 and considered dormant unless reactivated with code sequence Sigma Delta Echo. He asked her if she was one of those assets, and she said no, she was the one who buried the others. She was the one they left behind on purpose. He sat down then because his legs suddenly felt too weak to carry the weight of what she was saying. He asked how she had gotten back onto the grid, and she said the signal was activated 3 nights ago, in a place no one was watching, a cold transmission sent from a lost satellite still orbiting above the wrong side of the planet. It was a trigger, a call to return, a beacon that only those marked like her would understand, and she had fall. They moved through the inner corridors of the base like shadows, unnoticed by most and unchallenged by those who saw them. The officer walked slightly behind her now, not out of rank or hesitation, but because he understood that whatever authority she carried, it was not given, it was earned, and not by medals or protocol, but by survival, by walking through places that others never came back from. He asked her no more questions for a while because he could see in her face that something was shifting, something about the timing, something about the vault itself. Hallway leading to Sector 9 had been sealed off years ago, and officially it did not exist. The power to that part of the facility was cut, the cameras were disconnected, and even the floor plans had been redrawn to exclude it, but she knew the way, and every turn she made felt intentional, as if each step was guided by memory, not by guesswork. The walls around them grew darker, the lights more dim, the hum of electricity fading as they moved beyond the spaces where ordinary men worked and lived, and Trange stopped in front of a rusted steel door half hidden behind an old maintenance panel and placed her hand against it, her fingers tracing symbols carved deep into the frame, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. He stepped beside her, his voice low and uncertain, and asked, "What is this?" And she said, "This is the last door before the Lee ends, the last line between what they want to believe and what they buried, so no one would have to face it again." The officer reached for the keypad beside the door, but she shook her head and instead pulled from her jacket a small metal disc no bigger than a coin etched with the same symbol as her tattoo. She pressed it against a slot that looked like it hadn't been used in decades, and with a low mechanical hum the door released its lock, the seal hissing as old air spilled into the hallway. The door slid open with a sound like breath being drawn. After years of silence and the space beyond it was dark and wide and cold, they stepped inside and the temperature dropped immediately. The walls were lined with thick cables and strange metal boxes blinking with dull red lights despite the power being cut. She walked ahead of him, her steps slow and measured, and he followed her into the dark, not because he had to, but because something in him needed to know the truth, needed to see what she had seen, needed to understand why she had come back now after so many years hidden. She led him down a long tunnel that sloped downward, the air growing heavier with each step, the smell of metal and something else, something older, something like earth or dust or forgotten blood filled the space. And he began to feel the weight of whatever had been locked down here pressing against his chest. He asked her again what they were going to find, and this time she answered him with words that made his skin crawl. She said, "We are going to find what they swore never existed, what they promised they destroyed." But the tunnel opened into a chamber lit by a single flickering overhead light. The walls here were covered in old security monitors, now cracked and dark. The floor had markings etched into it that were not military, not scientific. They were symbols that looked ancient, but also precise, as if made with tools too delicate for human hands. In the center of the room was a console surrounded by glass panels, and beneath that glass something moved, something slow and unnatural, barely visible, but unmistakably. Olivia stepped closer, drawn by a mix of fear and curiosity, and what he saw below the glass made his breath catch. It was a body, but not like any human body he had seen. Its skin was dark and veined like stone, pulsing faintly with an inner light, its face covered by a mask that looked welded to the bone, and its chest rising and falling in a rhythm that was not breathing, not exactly. Something older, more controlled. He turned to her, his voice shaking, and asked, "What is it?" Said it was found during the Black Winter mission, not discovered, but uncovered, as if it had been waiting there beneath the ice, not dead, not alive, just dormant. They brought it back here against orders and tried to study it, and then the incidents began. Small at first, people losing time, hearing voices, seeing things in the mirrors that were not there, then bigger things, entire squads forgetting who they were, names disappearing. From records files vanishing from secured systems, she said eventually they realized it was not just a creature, it was a beacon, a link to something else. Asked why they didn't destroy it, and she said they tried fire, acid, electricity, nothing worked. It healed faster than they could hurt it, and every time they tried it responded by reaching into their minds, reshaping memories, rewriting orders. It wasn't just physical, it was something else, something capable of altering reality in ways they couldn't explain or contain, so they sealed it in the vault and buried the entire program, swore to never speak of it again, but someone broke that oath, and now it was waking up. The officer backed away from the glass, his heart pounding, and he asked who sent the signal, the one that activated her, and she said, I don't know, but whoever it was knew where to find me and how to trigger the code, and that means someone high, someone with access, someone who wants it awake again for a reason. That cannot be good. She looked down at the body in the glass, and her face hardened like stone, and she said, I came here to make sure it never gets out again, not now, not ever. Asked her if it could be stopped this time, and she said, maybe, but not without help and not without sacrifice, because what lies beneath this glass is only part of the truth. The rest is still buried deeper, and if it rises again, the world as we know it will fracture. She turned toward a second door on the far side of the chamber, a door sealed by something more than lock, something that shimmered faintly like heat in the air, and she said behind that door is where they kept the others, the ones that didn't survive the experiment. She looked at her and saw something in her eyes that he hadn't seen before, not fear, not sorrow, but something worse, the weight of memory, the cost of what she had done, the things she had seen and carried and never shared. She walked to the second door and placed her hand on it and said, this is where it really begins, and once we open this, there is no turning back. And he nodded slowly, knowing the moment was coming when he would have to choose between the world he thought he knew and the truth she carried in silence. For so long, second door stood silent before them, not just a barrier of steel and code, but something more ancient, more deliberate. The air around it vibrated faintly like the hum of a wire pulled too tight, like sound trapped in a place where time had forgotten how to move. The officer stood close enough to feel it, a strange warmth seeping from the seams of the frame, a warmth that felt unnatural, like it did not belong to the world above ground or even to the body beneath the glass. Behind them, he asked her again what was behind it, and she closed her eyes for a moment before she answered. She said they were the failures, the prototypes, the things that came before the body sealed in glass, things made, not found, things built from a design that no one fully understood, copied from scraps, recovered from ruins that predated even the oldest records, and twisted by ambition and fear and the hunger to control something that could never be tamed. She said they used prisoners at first, then volunteers, then soldiers, until it became clear that the process changed not just the body, but the soul, if there was still such a thing left. He felt his hands clench without realizing it, and asked how many were inside, and she said 12, but that was only the number that survived. The others were gone in ways no one could explain, not killed, not destroyed, just gone, erased from existence as if they had never been born at all, and the ones that remained had to be sealed with more than steel. They were sealed with sound, with ritual, with math so deep and old that even the engineers who created the lock refused to speak about it. After it was, Donish stepped forward, now placing both hands on the smooth surface of the door, and whispered something too soft for him to hear, and suddenly the door shimmered again, not like heat, but like water breaking surface, and then the symbols began to glow, lines carved into the steel lit up with faint red light as if responding to her voice or her presence, or maybe something inside that remembered her, something that had waited all this time to feel her touch again. Stepped back as the door began to open, not with a hiss, not with a mechanical groan, but with silence, the kind of silence that presses on the chest and makes the heart beat louder because it feels wrong, like the world is holding its breath. They stood there as the door split and the gap widened and darkness spilled out thick and slow, not like shadow, but like smoke, without a source, without scent, without form, but with weight. Inside the chamber there were no lights, yet somehow they could see. The room was circular and lined with pods, each one tall and narrow like a human sarcophagus, each one Pulsing faintly with dull red light through the glass of each pod, they could see shapes humanoid, but distorted the skin on them gray and cracked the limbs longer than they should be, the eyes closed but moving under the lids, twitching as if locked. In some endless dream or memory, walked slowly past the first pod, unable to look away from the face behind the glass, and though it was changed, though it was wrong, he felt like he knew it somehow, like it used to belong to someone he once trusted. Someone who had gone missing years ago during a mission that had no after-action report and no official record. He turned to her, his voice rough, and asked, "Were these all soldiers?" And she nodded. "Not all from our side, some were enemies, some." The officer stood frozen in the chamber, his eyes locked on the glowing red light of the pod that had once held her and now pulsed faster with every passing second, like it knew she was near, like it remembered her, like it wanted her to finish what had been started so many years ago. The air felt heavier, now thicker, with something invisible like pressure building behind a door not yet opened, but already cracking along the seams. He turned to her and saw the change already happening in her. Something deeper than fear, something older than memory, stepped away from the pod, her steps deliberate, her gaze scanning the chamber, and she said, "The signal is accelerating. It is no longer just a wake-up call, it is a synchronization. It is pulling everything into alignment. Everything that was planted, everything that was buried and hidden is now responding across the world and places no one remembers, insights erased from history. It is growing, and it will not stop unless we do something from here, from now." The officer asked her what they could do if containment was no longer enough and if destruction was not possible, and she looked at him with a stillness that made him uneasy and said, "There's one option, but it will come at a cost, because the seed was never meant to be held or studied, it was meant to be carried, and when it found a host it latched onto more than just biology, it latched onto the voice, onto the mind, onto the soul, and I was the first to carry it, and I am still the only one who walked away still myself, or at least Mosley." Asked her what the cost would be, and she said, "I can go back into the pod, I can complete the cycle, and if I do the signal will collapse because it is still tied to me, it still searches for me, and if I return to it, if I give it what it wants, it will stop reaching, and the others will fall back into silence, not forever, but long enough for the world to breathe again, for the world to forget again, just like before." Officer stepped toward her and shook his head and said, "That cannot be the only way. There must be another way, something they missed, something the scientists never discovered." And she smiled, not with joy, but with the tired understanding of someone who had seen too much, and said, "There were no scientists here, only believers, people who thought they could tame the unknown by giving it structure, by putting it in a lab, by surrounding it with metal and numbers. But this thing, this seed, this force, was never meant to be studied." Only Firage walked to the console near the center of the room, her hand hovering above the glass screen, now lit with unreadable symbols flowing like language from a forgotten world, and she said, "This system was designed to release or reseal the pods, but the protocol to reseal requires a living connection, a host that the system recognizes, one who bears the mark and the memory, and I am the last, the only one left who can do it. The rest are gone, lost too. Madness or worse, their bodies still here, but their minds no longer reachable." The officer asked her what would happen if she failed, if the system rejected her, and she said, "Then the pods will open, and whatever is left inside them, whatever hunger or memory or rage, will spill out into the world, and the world will not be ready, because the world has never been ready, not in all the time since the first vault was sealed, the first signal was sent, the first lie was written into the stone." Looked at her then and saw the truth written, not in her face, but in her posture, in the way she stood, in the way she breathed, like someone carrying a weight that could not be put down, only passed on. He asked if she was sure she could still do it, and she said, "I do not know, but I am going to try, because if I do nothing, they will win, and if they win, it will not be like a war, it will not be fire and bombs, it will be erasure, it will be forgetting, it will be silence swallowing everything until Nothing human remained. Placed her hand on the screen, and the console responded instantly. Lines of red light shooting out across the floor, connecting to the pods, to the door, to the air itself, and a low vibration filled the chamber, a sound so deep it felt like it came from the bones of the earth, not from anything man-made. The light around her shifted, and the pod that had once held her began to open its glass, sliding back with a whisper and a gust of cold air that smelled like sleep and metal. And time. The officer moved toward her again, his hand outstretched as if he could stop her, as if he could pull her back from the edge. But she looked at him and said, "You have to be the one to seal the system once I am inside, once it recognizes the link. You will have a window of exactly 13 seconds to engage the final lock. If you miss it, the cycle will break, and it will all be for nothing." He nodded slowly, his throat tight, because he knew what she was giving up, and he knew there was nothing he could say to change her mind. Stepped into the pod, her body moving like she had done this before, like some part of her still remembered the first time she had entered this metal coffin, the first time they had sealed her away, and hoped that whatever they had created would remain contained. But it had not remained. It had waited, and now it called again, and this time she answered, not with fear but with purpose. The glass began to close, and the red light pulsed faster, and the console screamed in a language no one living could understand, and the officer stepped forward, watching the symbols shift and settle, and then the screen blinked once, and he pressed the final sequence, his fingers trembling as the command registered. And the entire room began to shake, not with violence, but with resonance, like a sound wave passing through stone and memory and the past itself. Pods around the chamber stopped moving, the lights dimming one by one, and the darkness returned, not with menace, but with peace, like something had been put to sleep, not forever, but deep enough to matter. The console powered down, the symbols fading into black, and the glass of her pod turned opaque, hiding her from view, locking her away again for the last time, or the next time. No one could be. Saray stood there in the silence of the chamber, alone now, with only the echo of her last words in his mind, and the sense that something enormous had just been delayed, not defeated, but delayed. And he knew that somewhere out there the signal had stopped, but the memory of it would remain, and so would he, guarding this vault, guarding the truth until the world forgot again. The chamber fell into silence as the last light died and the heavy glass of the pod sealed itself shut. The officer stood alone now in the cold darkness, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle deep in his chest, his breath shallow, and then even his mind racing to catch up with the storm of thoughts crashing through it. He moved slowly away from the pod toward the exit, but something stopped him, a faint hum vibrating beneath his feet, a pulse almost imperceptible but growing stronger with every passing second. He knelt down, placing his hand on the cold floor, feeling the vibration spreading like roots deep beneath the concrete, reaching beyond the vault, beyond the base, beyond everything he had known before. The pulse carried a message, or a warning, or maybe a call, a reminder that despite the seal, despite the sacrifice, the seed was still alive, still stirring somewhere in the shadows, waiting for the moment when the world's defenses slipped once more outside the chamber. The base was quiet, but the silence felt unnatural, as if the very air held its breath, waiting for the next move. The officer made his way through the winding corridors, his footsteps echoing hollow in the empty halls. The faces of past soldiers staring from faded photographs on the walls seemed to watch him passing. A ghost among ghosts, carrying a burden heavier than any weapon could inflict, reached the control room, the heart of the base, and activated the main terminal, the screen flickering to life, revealing rows of encrypted data files hidden deep in the system logs. He scrolled through them, searching for any clues about the origin of the signal, the reason for the awakening, the name behind the voice that had called her back after all these years, but the files were incomplete, corrupted, or erased, leaving behind only fragments of truth buried under layers of secrecy. His fingers paused on one file labeled Project Lazarus, an odd name for a mission that no one spoke of officially, but the fragments described experiments on reanimation, on melding consciousness with unknown biological material, on attempts to bridge life and something beyond life, something not quite human yet not fully alien either. It spoke of failures and sacrifices, and a warning that the results were unpredictable, uncontrollable, And deadly the officer felt a chill creeping down his spine and wondered how many more secrets were hidden beneath the layers of lies, how many lives had been swallowed up by this project and forgotten by those who ordered it in shadows where men played gods with no concern for the cost. The files hinted at a connection between Project Lazarus and the ancient symbols carved into the vault walls, symbols that matched the tattoo on her arm and the seal on the pods, but the details were missing. Like pieces torn from a puzzle, he leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples, exhausted and frustrated. But then a soft sound caught his attention, a faint whisper on the intercom, a voice too low to be understood, but familiar as if carried on the wind from a distant memory. He traced the signal to a secure channel, one that had been offline for years, and with trembling hands he activated the feed. The screen flickered and a figure appeared, cloaked in shadow, the face indistinct, but the presence undeniable. The voice was hers, the woman who had entered the pod, the voice speaking words that were not quite language, but not entirely silence either, a haunting melody that resonated deep within his men.